Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this discussion on the beginnings of the early church. We've been meeting online regularly for many weeks now, since the week before Holy Week. And so each Thursday morning, we've looked at an aspect of the scriptures. And so this week, we are anticipating Pentecost, which will be celebrated on Sunday, the 31st of May. And so today we will look at a very general overview of the book of Acts. But before we do so, join me in prayer. Gracious God, we are so grateful for opportunities to look at our scriptures, how they impact our life today, and the interest that it evokes in us to know something about the beginnings of our faith. And so bless us with wisdom and understanding as we learn from others, from scholars, as we learn from the scriptures themselves. And we trust, O God, that as you inspire us through your Holy Spirit, that we will in turn be able to bless one another. In the name of Christ. Amen. Just a few verses from Acts chapter 1 to help us get into the frame of mind of who wrote the book and what was the purpose that this author wrote the book. So it is in the form of a letter and starts, Dear Theophilus, in my first book, which is the Gospel according to Luke, I wrote about all the things that Jesus did and taught from the time he began his work until the day he was taken up into heaven, which is what we celebrated last week with the Ascension. Before he was taken up, he gave instructions by the power of the Holy Spirit to those he had chosen to be his apostles. For 40 days after his death, he appeared to them many times in ways that proved beyond doubt that he was indeed alive. They saw him, and he talked with them about the realm of God. And when they came together, Jesus gave them this order: Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift I told you about, the gift that God has promised. John baptized with water, but in a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. Thanks be to God for those few verses from the Good News Bible translation of the book of Acts, chapter 1. So what is this book all about? And it is the birthday of the church, which we will be celebrating on Sunday. And so Acts is an important book for us to weigh up, because I'm hoping I'll point out a few comments and points that enable us to see why the book of Acts is a significant book. I think it would be fascinating to study the whole book of Acts, but for these weekly online discussions, we merely take a look at a small component of the passages set for the coming Sunday. That's what I have been doing so far, and it's working. And I really appreciate any comments or questions that people offer. And sometimes if you have a recommendation, we could look at a specific passage in the future. It is definitely worth doing this because Acts is an important book. So what is the book of Acts all about? And why does it intrigue so many scholars? And so now we know that the author is Luke. And so often we have to take the Gospel and the book of Acts together as one unit to make complete sense of it. But Luke Acts, for interest's sake, makes up a little more than a fourth, one of the scholars says, of the whole New Testament. And so just volume-wise, it is significant. At the time of recording these stories, we have to realize that scrolls were incredibly valuable. So Luke must have believed that recording the gospel stories of Jesus and the Acts of the Apostles, which is what the book is called, was indeed an important task. This book also provides us with an account of the changes that took place during those early years of the church's story. Many things changed, and it's very helpful for us to look at changes in the church right at the beginning, because we are in an era where things are changing rapidly in our experience of church. The disciples became transformed. It was an incredible thing to witness. So some of the stories we see often that Peter is the impulsive one. He's the one that sometimes speaks without thinking. He's the one that says to Jesus, "No, we can't come to Jerusalem. They're going to kill you. That is too dangerous." And he's the one that when Jesus has already been arrested says, "I don't know the man." And on Pentecost, what happens to Peter? He's filled with the Holy Spirit and he becomes a gifted preacher. And so an amazing transformation happens to these people. Pentecost story is one of bold empowerment. That's what makes it so exciting and intriguing. This book also fills some gaps for us between the gospel stories and the missionary stories of Paul and others. So as soon as we get beyond Acts, then we have the letters, the epistles, of the churches that have already been formed. So unless we read the book of Acts, it's very difficult to understand the context of the stories and the letters that Paul writes and others write as well. It would be more difficult for us to understand what happened during the Gentile mission without the book of Acts. The stories about the church begin in Jerusalem, and the book ends with stories of Paul being imprisoned in Rome. And so it spans many years. I'm not sure if any scholars have actually been able to say exactly how many years, but we believe it was a big block of time. This book describes how geographically, theologically, and even also racially, the church developed. So geographically, we know now. The disciples were Jewish people and they were living in around Jerusalem or Capernaum. And they were Jewish men, all of them, and there were obviously women involved, but the apostles, we believe, were 12 men. Theologically, it developed because they were Jewish men, and now Jesus had come to give them some extra instructions. Some of the ways that Jesus taught people to live and be and love one another were challenging for Jewish people. And then racially was the big stumbling block for many of them. Because before Jesus came, the Jewish people believed that God was only for the Jews. And all of a sudden, Jesus opens a path that says that Gentiles are very welcome. The way he interacted with the Syrophoenician woman and a centurion, we just know that Jesus had a space for Gentile people. And the Christian church's main opposition, unfortunately, in the very beginning, was Judaism, or the Jewish leaders, because a faith or an ideology as such cannot be the opposition. It's those who are practicing that faith, who are proposing that faith. So it was the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the high priests. They were the ones who were very cautious, and many of them absolutely opposed to what Jesus taught. It threatened them. I mean, if one thinks about the beginning of them saying, see how they love one another, how could any ideology or any group of people be challenged or threatened by people who love one another? It's a complicated thing that happened there. But in the book of Acts, what is very important is that what Paul did theologically in the book of Romans, Luke did historically in the book of Acts. So the book of Romans is accepted to really be a doctrinal book where Paul spells out what Christianity looks like, what it means. And in the book of Acts, historically, is how Luke showed what happened. Perhaps not absolutely chronologically, but most often, every new mission that Paul and Mark and Silas and Peter undertook is there's a point, there's a place that you can find on a map. And so historically, the book of Acts is so helpful for us. Luke Acts, which should be seen actually as one work in two parts, provide us with some historical details. And as I said, many Bibles even come equipped with a map so that you can actually plot the missionary journeys yourself. I enjoyed those very much when we were teenagers and at youth or senior Sunday school, we would do some of Paul's missionary journeys, and I loved to follow where they went next and what happened at Troas and Antioch, and then they went to Philippi and Ephesus, and to see these places on an actual map is fascinating. When we read the epistles, which is a big word for letters, the letters of Paul to the churches in Thessalonica or Ephesus or Philippi, we know much about them and how they started from the accounts that Luke has provided for us in the book of Acts. And so we see how these are related. And it's more difficult to understand the context of the letter unless you know a little bit about the history and the time when they visited there. The book of Acts contains a dramatic portrayal of the power of God at work in the church through the Holy Spirit, which began at Pentecost. Now, Pentecost was already a celebration of the Jewish people. Pentecost happened 50 days after Passover, and so it coincided very much with what was happening in the Christian tradition in the early years. Acts depicts Jesus Christ at work in the church through the Holy Spirit. It is a continuation of the gospel stories, but at the end of Luke, the ascension happens, and at the beginning of Acts, we are told about the Holy Spirit coming upon these disciples. The beginnings of the age of the Spirit are found in Acts, and only in Acts. A small, fearful, unpromising group of people become a revolutionary force, transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. Exciting to even think about it. Acts provides a defense of the apostleship of Paul. Now that is very important because Paul was not one of the 12. You may remember when we did the discussion of Stephen, when the people were stoning Stephen, they put their coats, they laid them on the ground, and the young man who was looking after the coats, his name was Paul. And so Paul comes on the scene in a very strange way. he was one of the persecutors of the Christians. And so we would have to read the next few chapters of Acts to read about his conversion experience. When he was traveling around, going to Damascus to hunt down Christians, and God confronted him, and he has an encounter with the living Christ. So his apostleship needs to be defended, and that happens in the book of Acts. If one were to read the letters of Paul apart from the book of Acts, one would wonder who he was and what right he had to speak with such authority. And so we see how the two are absolutely important to feed into each other, information and background. Acts not only contains the account of Paul's conversion, and there are 3 accounts of them, which hopefully we will deal with at one of our discussions, but it is an account of the way in which God appointed him as an apostle. In spite of the actions and early resistance of the other apostles in that early time of the church, we can understand that here is this guy, Saul. Saul was the young man who was looking after the coats at the stoning of Stephen. And now all of a sudden he comes after a journey up to Damascus and wants to convince Peter and the rest of the disciples, they being called apostles at this time, that he was now one of them. One can just see the reluctance. What happened? And so they have to listen to his conversion experience and see that he means business. And it must come through his witness so that they can see he is genuine. Acts has, though, created division. Some charismatic Christians, and charismatic, it's a term that they've used for people who pay a lot of attention to the gifts of the Holy Spirit, such as speaking in tongues and a healing ministry and other kind of elements of being filled with the Holy Spirit, which we will read in the book of Acts. And then there are those who are anti-charismatic, or the ones who minimize the importance of these gifts of the Holy Spirit, as it is merely transitional. Now, I would suggest that neither position is totally correct, because we are people of a faith, of a tradition that believes that God is involved in a mysterious way. And so what happened in the early church may not always be replicated now, but so we need to find the value of what had happened then and what happens today. So it isn't an either or. I think it's a both and. It is for these and other reasons that I believe that the book of Acts is vital for our understanding and our practice of the gospel, because it highlights not only the traditional or the historical or the geographical, it highlights the miraculous, the spiritual, those things that were absolutely remarkable. On Sunday we will read again that the disciples were filled with the Spirit of God and began to speak in other languages. It's beyond our imagination. For anyone who's tried to learn a new language, we know that it's years and years of lots of effort. But something happened that the people in Jerusalem at that time understood these Galileans. And so I've really enjoyed looking up these facts, very much an overview of the book of Acts, because it's right at the beginning as we anticipate celebrating Pentecost. And next week we will look at another aspect of the early church. And so thank you for joining me today, and please do also join me as we prepare to celebrate Pentecost once again. And so at 10:30 on Sunday morning, the worship service will be available for you to enjoy and participate in. And so until next time, God bless you. Bye bye.